Thank you so much for that lovely welcome. Yeah, it's fantastic to be here this morning with you. It's rather ironic that, you know, there is a technological problem and we'll try and figure our way through it, and it's entirely my fault, this particular problem. But as you heard, my name's Rhonda Wilson, and I would like to, and I'm sorry about the quality of these slides that you're seeing at the moment, but as a First Nations woman, I would like to acknowledge that I'm a descendant of the Wiradjuri Nation, and I'm a visitor to this country that we're standing on now. But I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where we gather today, the Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respect to elders past, present, and leaders who are emerging. And I also want to extend this respect to the Darkinjung people, the traditional custodians of the land where I work at the University of Newcastle on the Central Coast campus, and where I live with my family. So I am very, very pleased to be back here on Ngunnawal country. I was a member of the university 2 years ago, and so it is very familiar coming back and very warm to come back to this Ngunnawal country. I'd like to talk to you a little bit today about these themes, and I'm just thrilled to have listened to Tim's presentation earlier because there were just so many synergies, and I thought this is very, very exciting. And I love research, love finding out new things, love just trying to understand social health phenomena, and particularly in the digital context. So today I want to talk a little bit about setting that digital context from my perspective as a nursing scientist and a mental health nursing scientist. And I want to suggest some of the determinants of perhaps missing out of the inequalities and inequity that we've already heard about this morning. I also want to talk to you about some phrasing as well, priority and vulnerability. And I'd really like us to have a think about those terms. Of course, we can't explore this topic adequately without talking about inequity, but I want us to also think about how we design digital interventions for health to address some of these inequities, or at least to consider them. And then I'd like to present you with a couple of examples from my practice in my laboratory at the University of Newcastle called EcoWell. So I'm hoping that as I talk, we might be able to flip over to the slides with a clearer presentation. But as you know, over recent times, the digital environment has been rapidly expanding, and I'm going to be talking to you mostly about the health and wellbeing context. And we've already heard terms like innovative this morning. Innovative new possibilities for health service delivery do include the administration of digital health interventions as solutions to address health problems. And I really appreciated again Tim's, here we go, that's looking a lot nicer, thank you very much. Okay, so Tim talked about the words innovation and solutions, and I struggle with that terminology as well. But certainly I know that some of you in the audience today, whether here physically or virtually, will be interested in innovation, and commercial partners certainly are very interested in innovation, and government funding bodies are usually very interested in innovation. And they see innovations as having the potential for solutions to arise. From my perspective as a nurse, I find that a very biomedical model that we've adopted into the tech sector as well, to think about a medicine that might cure a disease, which happens extremely rarely indeed. And I think that while there are loads of possibilities to improve health and well-being for individuals and sometimes perhaps for communities as well, I'm not sure that they will ever be solutions. But in Tech Talk, we might talk about them as solutions. So I'm interested in mental health or social and emotional well-being from a First Nations perspective in particular. And so it's a fusion of applied mental health sciences and digital sciences. And this is a non-traditional collaboration for health professionals. Usually in the health context, when we talk about collaborations and interprofessional collaborations, it would be with other nurses, doctors, social workers, psychologists, you know, in the health domain, in health disciplines. But what I really love about working in a much broader context in terms of interdisciplinary work is that we get to work with computing scientists, the technological sector, social geographers, and social scientists. And I find that that really helps me to explore mental health and social emotional well-beings in a new and creative way. And I think when we're thinking about solving complex health problems and sometimes wicked problems, that we need to think about them in non-traditional ways, to explore the phenomena from alternative lenses, in an attempt to understand how we might make some improvements going forward. So this is very non-traditional work in one sense, although it has been going some time in mental health. And I suppose mental health has been a field of early adoption in this space. And there are loads of mental health digital solutions, I suppose. You can go to the App Store and you can find hundreds of thousands of them. Not all of them, in fact, very, very few of them have scientific evidence to suggest that they might actually be clinically effective. And to what extent some might be harmful, we have absolutely no idea. So it's a very murky world indeed if we're actually intent on improving human health through this means and mental health and well-being. Nevertheless, during COVID, we've had a whole stack of extra pressures, I suppose, on health systems and indeed throughout society. And we've needed to, all these catch and cliche words like pivot and change and adapt to finding ways to work with people, our patients, our consumers, our users, service users, without actually coming in face-to-face contact with them. So digital means has been a very important way of health service delivery over the last 2 years in particular, and has expanded significantly as a result. But nevertheless, prior to that and continuing on, despite the fact that we've got some nice evidence in terms of digital health interventions being useful for some populations, there are a lot of challenges in terms of developing scalability, cost effectiveness, and transferring to treatment as usual. And just for context, in the health context, usually it takes from development of a new health innovation of whatever type it might be into treatment as usual, it would probably take an average of 17 years to make that change in the health service, in health service delivery. Now that's clearly not going to work when it comes to technological sector, because the technology is well and truly outdated then. And so, you know, that does present us with a few challenges, and Tim's given us plenty to think about in that context as well. But what I want to suggest to you today is, you know, we're familiar with things like determinants of health and well-being, and but I'm going to suggest to you determinants of missing out because who are the people that digital mental health services actually work for, and who misses out? And I think this is a really important question for developers and researchers to think about. So I think there are three main aspects that really frame digital inequity. And again, we've heard them, these concepts already today as well, and I'm sure that that'll be the discussion for the remainder of the 2 days as well. That digital access, digital literacy, and digital safety are factors that really need to frame our discussions, our considerations as we think about how this, how we will move forward in terms of developing digital health, because digital health interventions are not going to go away. It's not something that governments around the world are interested in disposing of post-COVID. There is a political belief that digital health is an important alternative. And so that will continue to be funded because of that. There are political agendas that we need to consider and understand how they influence our practice as researchers and clinicians. So there are some theoretical standpoints, and one particular theoretical standpoint theory that I find very interesting is Indigenous feminist standpoint theory. I see some thumbs up in the room. And, you know, it talks about who are the people who are powerful, who have political power, social power, and economic power. And it explains why it is very difficult for women, and particularly Indigenous women, to be taken seriously in pretty much any domain, because there is a social order, a social construct that keeps us in a particular position in society. And while we mightn't necessarily understand that, from a, you know, in your interactions on a day-to-day basis, I suppose we can put that down to our unconscious bias and sometimes from a perspective of privilege. And so sometimes, as with racism, when you have a particular privilege, you're not actually, you know, don't always see the privilege and the racism and the systemic racism that exists. And we have to think about how the technology sector and moving into digital health in expanding ways, we need to be very considerate and mindful of, are we just perpetuating the way things have always been done? And will there be any of that empowerment that we hoped for? Empowerment is a very interesting word. And as Tim said, it does require that somebody else gives up some of their power. And it's very difficult for people to do that if they cannot in fact see that their privilege is enabling their power and detracting from the empowerment of other people. So we have there are some really deep you know, philosophical and theoretical positions that we can look at in far more detail, and today's not the place for that, other than to just flag this is a place to do more reading if you don't know much about it, because it will be important in terms of developing digital technologies that suit health industry going forward. But so far, really, we have to consider that technology has pretty much a default and mostly Western male position. And that standpoint in itself influences how health services, digital health services are going to be delivered, and what types of things will be of interest. It makes other cultures and genders invisible in one sense. And so we need to be mindful of what we can't quite see and exposing the invisible in that sense as well. Otherwise, those people will be the ones that are missing out, and it will perpetuate going forward. A traditional approach has been a biomedical dominance of assessment and treatment paradigm in the health sector. It doesn't talk about health and well-being It frames in a negative discourse, and we'll talk about that more shortly. But we've certainly learnt some lessons from the pharmaceutical industry, for example, and particularly in the sense of commercial gain. So as we move into digital health, we need to consider also the commercial interests that we need to work with, particularly with the commercial sector, and remember the lessons that we've learned from pharmacology. Things, and one reference point might be to think about from the pharmaceutical experiences. Depression is a very difficult condition to treat with medication. And in fact, there is a whole industry that has built up lots of different medications to provide to people in order to ease depression. And almost all of them don't work. Less than 50% of the medications that we give the population are known not to be clinically effective. So we know that overall, if we look at all of the medications for depression, we know that about half the time, or just slightly under half the time, those prescriptions are administered, we can expect less than half of them to be clinically effective. So will we be perpetuating that in terms of the digital health that we might deliver, because there is a need to service the commercial gain as well? So we need to be very, very careful. And we need to be careful about what funding instruments are used so that we don't perpetuate the status quo, but we do actually start to reach people who need the supports that we have to offer. So I'd like to turn the discussion now to priority and vulnerability. And I think this is a really interesting reframe, if you like, when we think about social and political and economic power. And I think missing out is inextricably linked to a lack of privilege. People who are privileged don't miss out to the same extent that people that don't have privilege. A key narrative to help us understand the phenomena of missing out is about deficit-based narratives. And you know, we have a lot of deficit-based narratives, particularly in mental health. We think about that as in terms of deficit and stigma a lot. And while there has been a great deal of progress over the last 15 years even, I would say, still stigma persists in mental health. And other negative narratives that we might have, or deficit narratives that we might have in our society, will be around talking about the gap. We've just had the National Close the Gap Day. We talk about gaps, we talk about deficits, we talk about insufficiency, we talk about not meeting gaps, we talk about divides, we talk about, and these are negatively framed discourses. That's problematic because deficits are associated with less social, political and economic power. Even in our journalistic, for example, discourse, we will read in news about it's a dark day. You know, there is often a negative discourse associated with blackness, and so we have a negative discourse about racism. We fail to talk as much about the strengths. And what happens is that we have a society that blames people for their vulnerability, reinforcing the privilege of social order. In health, an example might be you eat too many hamburgers, you drink too much alcohol, you become too overweight, you get diabetes, you get a whole stack of other comorbid problems. It's your fault. We blame you and stigma, and there is a negative discourse. We blame the people who are vulnerable and therefore reinforce you know, the social order around that. So we blame people for their vulnerability. That's what a vulnerable discourse leads to, I think. But if we start to flip the narrative and, you know, we think what happens if the standpoint shifts and we start to think about populations or people as priorities rather than as vulnerabilities, we cast the actors then as, instead of being vulnerable, we reframe them with a narrative that denotes a priority. And this shifts the responsibility from absolving ourselves from doing anything to shift the status quo with the shame of blame on the shoulders of the vulnerable. Society has to recognise then that the inequity or disparity is a priority, and then the locus for change shifts. The responsibility to act moves to government, society, social responsibility is we have to enact that change. And that priority resets the responsibility for action at the feet of people just like us in this room and in our Zoom room today, developing the innovation to promote health, wellbeing and equity and change. It's our responsibility to start to flip that narrative and to start to talk about priorities and require change in that direction. We've already talked a little about inequality, and I won't take a great deal of time here, I hope, but I think there are shades of missing out as well. And we know that women have less access, globally, women have less access to digital resources, and they're more likely to have to share or borrow hardware to access the internet. Now, this is very important when we're thinking about mental health of women in particular. And you can imagine that in a mental health consultation, you have some fairly sensitive things to talk about very often. And some of the triggers for mental ill health can be they're often trauma related. So to have to share the technology or the hardware to be able to be treated for those types of situations is very challenging indeed. Nevertheless, I think we've happened upon an occurrence rather than planned for it or designed for it. There is one area of success in digital mental health, and where we've seen cost effectiveness, at least as cost effective as face-to-face treatment, and that's with women who use internet-based cognitive behavioural therapy, which is a treatment, a gold standard treatment, a psychosocial treatment that is used to treat anxiety and depression. Now, we've found that ICBT, when we've done clinical trials, works for women of a particular category. They would need to be reasonably well educated, reasonably affluent, and about middle-aged. Now and probably Western. And those characteristics perhaps fit with disparity, gender disparity, pay disparity. Women in those types of groups usually work in middle areas of the economy, middle management. They open a lot of folders, they do what's inside a folder, they use those hierarchical trees, they close the folder, they do the next. Now, in CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, each week you have a meeting with your therapist in the face-to-face version, and you might have some homework. Well, just to simply put that online, women will do that, but nobody else will, because nobody else follows rules and does what they're told the way a middle-aged, reasonably affluent and reasonably educated woman will do. So we've happened upon this, but for just about every other mental health condition where there is a digital intervention, we really don't have a clue whether it's clinically effective or not. The science has not been done to be conclusive that we're actually making a difference and that it's any better than face-to-face versions. For men, we certainly don't have any clues about that. They're not very good at doing what they're told and opening folders and closing them, I'd suggest. But And again, Tim alluded to this as well. Sometimes digital is dangerous. And in fact, the World Health Organization has described a new disease. It's called gaming disorder. And so we figured out a whole way of treating this particular disorder. So sometimes what we do has hazards for human health. So there are really ethical things to think about in terms of delivering health in digital means. Some of the research I've done, particularly in Denmark, has suggested that older people have had really positive sentiment about participating in digital mental health interventions, particularly for depression, but it's their middle-aged clinicians who are more reluctant to engage with it. So the sentiment is there for older people it seems in our research, people did want to be included and they did want to have access in that type of way. But we have those middle-aged people again in the clinical services where they have all this fabulous clinical experience, reluctant to engage. So that's a challenge for us. CALD and First Nations people miss out at really significant rates, and there's been some really great work done by Hunter and Riddell. Peter Riddell was PVC Indigenous here at University of Canberra, and he's certainly been part of this work as well to describe just the extent of disparity around access to the internet for First Nations people in Australia. Rural, regional and remote communities miss out. Goes without saying, access can be patchy. Costs for internet and phone plans can be unsustainable for communities where there are lower socioeconomic circumstances and where they're predominant. And of course in Australia, our geographical scale is large. So how do we then design for some of these priority populations? And the design is incredibly important, and it needs to be co-designed with end users from inception to implementation. It's about those partnerships again, instead of doing to, working with. And this is really, really critical. And I suppose COVID-19 has challenged developers and researchers and clinicians to rapidly escalate digital responses to service delivery needs and to consider the lessons learnt in the past while driving ethical responses into the future. And this is really critical. In health, we seek to do no harm with our health interventions. And so it does take us a great deal of time to develop a safe intervention. Telehealth and video consultation are important modalities to avoid the cross-contamination during face-to-face health consultations. There's no two ways about that. You know, the way of measuring that is we simply had to pivot to non-face-to-face ways of delivering health consultations, and we will have to do it again in the future. This is a pandemic now. We're going to see these arise again in the future. The infection control scientists, epidemiologists are telling us that all the time. So we do need to have digital health responses that are adequate for times such as pandemic need. So it's vital to pay closer attention to including priority end users, not vulnerable end users, but priority end users into the co-design of digital innovations for health, wellbeing and mental health. Some of the challenges we have are around the government funding models and instruments and commercial stakeholders. But they should start to prioritise their key performance indicators that will champion inclusion of priority populations at all stages of design and development, from inception to implementation. And if you remember nothing else from my presentation, that would be the key thing, that we have to engage with end users. We have to design for safe practice as well, and by that I mean health practice. And that's going to involve testing, transparency, and trust. We have to pay attention to the human-computer interactions, the digital platform design for target groups. We have to think about whether it's text-based or whether cognitive imagery diagrams are helpful, or whether effective imagery that's warm and friendly might assist. Older people prefer text-based, younger people prefer cognitive imagery. But if we add affective imagery, does it help us to get our health messaging across? There's some science to suggest that that might be the case. So paying attention to the design, what it looks like in the platform experience is very important. And then there's the rights of digital therapeutic administration. In nursing, we have kind of this little rights of medication administration. We check we've got the right person, and we need to do, before we give the medication, because we don't want to give it to the wrong person. Same thing with a digital intervention. It needs to be safe. It needs to be the right therapy, the right therapy for the right person, with the right set of conditions. We need to know we're delivering the right dose. How many times would you need to open an app and do what's inside it? And, you know, what is the dose for the treatments we offer in the digital format? Is the time of day important? Do the people, the end users, the patients, have the right device or platform? Do they have access to that? Are the right agreements in place? Are the right settings and security settings in place? And is there scientific evidence to support that this is actually going to be clinically effective? And if it's not effective, what's the mechanism for stopping use? In technological development, people are used to this fail fast, frequently and forward notion. And those tests are really, really important in health. And they start simply with acceptability. Is it acceptable to the population that you're trying to deliver this intervention to? And so we have lots of iterations before we actually get to a randomised clinical trial, the gold standard that says this is actually clinically effective or not. But we have to pay attention to those iterations. So it is slow work. The logic of models needs to be transparent when we think about AI, for instance. What we do know about the science so far is that clinicians are suspicious about things in black boxes they can't see. They want to know how the decisions are made, what the decisional support system looks like, and what the rationale is for the decision making, so that they can use their clinical judgment, which we need them to do. So, glass models perhaps offer, more in order to develop trust, so clinicians will be content to use. And critically, we need to have people with lived experience experts in mental health, and as priority populations, authentically engaged, because they are the end users. And if they're not involved from the inception, it's going to be very difficult. How's my time going? I must be up. I'm winding up. This is the last one. But this is perhaps the most exciting one, so please grab me over lunch if you'd like to know more, because this is my lab now. I'd like to introduce you to a couple of examples from my lab at the University of Newcastle called EcoWell. And this is a laboratory that is a digital health laboratory. It prioritises First Nations digital health. And so we're trying to develop interventions that suit priority populations first, and then administer to populations beyond that if it's suitable. So one of the things we're doing with First Nations is making it a priority, but we're developing some pop-up immersive sensory rooms, and we've got to some proof of concept work, and you can see my PhD student Oliver down the bottom tinkering away with some componentry, having a fabulous time. So we're making some pop-up immersive sensory rooms that we think we can take anywhere. And we wanted to play around with some accelerometers, so we put one in a sheep. So now we have sensor sheep. which led us to, of course, thinking about, what do we call them? I called them storyboards, but I think computing scientists, Oliver's a nurse and a computing scientist, so he's absolute gold. And you can't have him. he's staying in my lab until he finishes his PhD and beyond, I hope. So we developed censorship, and then what are those? You've got use cases. So we've extended it, use sheep, we're regional. But what we're doing is we're trying to make these sensory environments suitable for the de-escalation of anxiety and distress for First Nations people. We work with a school in North Queensland that has 450 First Nations students from all over Australia. It's a boarding school, 48 nations, First Nations are in this school. And you can imagine that being off country for a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is very, very challenging indeed and causes a lot of distress. And so we are working with elders from communities to simulate being on country. Now, it's not going to be as good as the real thing, but can we protect social and emotional well-being by offering an immersive experience that simulates being on country, using all of the senses, right down to working with Auntie Colleen here, and she's holding a fruit called cheese fruit. It's very smelly, but she also works with other traditional therapies. This one's for, I can't remember, it's good for your heart, I think, but it's very smelly. So, and they ferment this, and it's really interesting, and we will do some screening on the properties of cheese fruit, and I think a little bit of work has already been done. But she also works with green ants. Now, green ants kind of have a citrusy smell, and people in that community have traditionally used green ants as a decongestion. Some people might have used Vicks Vapor Rub or some product like that to clear the sinuses. Well, traditionally they're using green ant, and it clears you and makes you feel well. That's the feeling that we want to be able to simulate. How can we get a diffuser operating in our sensory room with green ant smell? I came back to the university, I talked to the nutrition scientists, don't usually talk to them, but I did. And they said, yeah, we can do that for you. So now we have green ant smell being developed as I speak to stick in our diffusers, to put in our sensory rooms. It's informed by Indigenous knowledge. We accept that Indigenous knowledge is knowledge. And, at that standpoint, we say this is the knowledge. And now we're going to try and understand what that means to transpose it into health intervention. So we're working with things like that. We're working with internationally with Digital Menopause International Task Force. Middle-aged women are forgotten in a lot of other, they're certainly, there's a lot of inequity there, I'll just say that. But we are working towards, some traditional techniques in terms of research collection and focus groups to get information from women across 6 different countries. And we've just finished all the data collection. We're doing the analysis now, and we're developing digital interventions to support women during menopause so they can stay at work, primarily our nurses during COVID. So we're doing some really, some interesting things. We're using Indigenous research methods. We're partnering with Indigenous communities. So digital health innovation has a Western male default privilege standpoint. Fact number 1, I think. Missing out, I'd like to point out, is a modifiable characteristic. We can do something about everybody who misses out if we want to. We can reframe from vulnerability to priority, and that propels us all towards a collective responsibility. We can design technology for priority populations by including end users in co-design from inception, developmental phases through to implementation. And we need those implementation scientists with us as well. We can address inequity across digital access, literacy and safety domains. Work has to be done there. And some of the examples from the lab that I'm working with from practice shows promise, and we're going to continue that work in an attempt to make a difference. So thank you very much, and those are my contact details. Thank you.